Welcome to the Sports Science Dudes. I am your host, Dr. Jose Antonio, with my co-host, Dr. Tony Ricci. If you're a first-time listener, hit the subscribe button and like the show. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Rumble, and YouTube. Our special guest today is Dr. Jorn Trommelen. He earned his PhD, and I will butcher this name, at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. Tony's probably laughing at me. Jorn Trommelen works as I think you're still an assistant professor or an associate professor. I'm not sure.
Yeah, still assistant professor, bringing the coffee to the other professors.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. So you're an assistant professor at the Department of Human Biology. You're involved in research and education regarding the impact of exercise and nutrition on muscle mass and function. Your research is part of the M3 research group and focuses on exercise and nutritional interventions to augment exercise performance adaptations in athletes. So, Jorn, I want to welcome you to the Sports Science Dudes. Thank you for taking time out. I know the time zone difference is kind of a pain when you're in Europe and here, but we appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, let's start off one of my favorite topics, protein. And your group recently did that study looking at, I believe it was the supplementation of casein post-exercise recovery. And I think the thing that surprised people most was the dosing, the 100-gram dose, and how you assess that there was a increase in muscle protein synthesis over really a long period of time. I think it was 12 hours. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah, explain a little bit about how you came up with the dosing. I think there was a 0 grams, 25 grams, and 100. And I know there are people online saying, why didn't you do 40 because or 20 or whatever? I mean, I'm sure there are good reasons for choosing it. People who don't do research, oftentimes they'll just come up with random numbers and say, hey, you should do a 0, a 20, a 40, and 100. I'm like, this costs a lot of money. You can't just do every possible, dosing. So explain how your group came up with the protocol and summarize the results.
Yeah, so very small clarification. The study was not casein, it was milk protein.
Milk, okay.
Milk protein is, of course, 80% casein, but it's also 20% whey protein. One of the reasons why we took milk protein is because it has the largest contribution to protein intake in the Western world. Whenever you do a study, people are always going to ask, what about this protein? What about that protein? Again, we picked the protein that has the largest contribution to protein intake in the Western world. So if anything, we have the most representative protein because it simply has the biggest contribution.
Makes sense.
But yeah, it does act like casein a lot. So why this study? Well, there have been quite some studies, including even one from our lab, dose response studies where different doses are compared. And for a pretty long time, I would say up until a month ago, it was very well accepted that about 20 grams of protein, that's all you need in a single meal. Because your body simply can't use more for muscle protein synthesis, building of new muscle tissue. And if you take more, the majority will be burned for fuel called oxidation. So how did we come up with this study question? Well, there's a lot of reasons why. One of them was inspired by a barbecue. I remember that once I woke up middle of the night, I went to pee and I kind of had like let's call it a meat burp. And I'm like, wait a minute, it's like 10 hours ago since I ate all this meat. I just feel I'm still digesting it. And I'm like, there's no, like if it's still in my GI tract, how could it possibly have reached my muscle and be built into that? So I'm like, when you consume large doses of protein, it's not really fair if we do studies that are only a couple hours long. Like you have to give it a chance to digest and, reach your peripheral tissues. So that was one thing. That's of course like a fun practical anecdote. I also looked at the data. one thing that, like, initially I was kind of in the protein distribution camp that, you know, you need to distribute your protein throughout the day to basically have the highest efficiency of your protein, because the big meals, most is wasted. But studies didn't really show that. The majority of like longer term data didn't really support that protein distribution concept. And I was just thinking those studies are underpowered, boring for the listeners, but just not enough subjects to clearly come to the right conclusion. But then time restricted feeding, intermittent fasting became very popular. And that's a very extreme model of theoretically suboptimal protein distribution. And still, you didn't see differences in muscle mass. So I was like, if such a suboptimal distribution pattern, if you don't even see big differences there, like, why are we arguing about 4 or 5 meals a day? Like, something isn't adding up. And then the last part is just a very small part, but I guess it added to the larger body of evidence. In nature, you have examples where, for example, snakes, they ate like 25% of their body mass in a meal. So if you're like a 100-kilogram bodybuilder, that's like a meal of 25 kilograms. Good luck with that. Of course, that doesn't necessarily say something about humans, but at least somewhere in nature, there is this concept that if you eat a big meal, you can use it, because they have done, it's pretty cool. They have done studies on these snakes, and you see that they are digesting for like 2 weeks. Muscle protein synthesis is elevated for 2 weeks. So for all these reasons, I just had the general ideas. When you give a large dose of protein, you need to give it a time to digest. You need to do studies that measure long enough to give the protein the chance to reach to the muscle. And that's what all these previous studies didn't do. Then your other question, why the 0, 25, and 100-gram dose? Just to be blunt, this study is absurdly expensive. Like, I won't bore you with the details, but we used the most amount of tracers built into the milk protein. Like, just the 100-gram dose is probably more expensive than most people's entire PhD project. Like, the methodology in this study was so absurdly insane, and probably, like, most people just like, oh, it's 100 grams of protein, you buy that for €2 or $3, dollars so weak, for $3 in at the store. But it's like insane how expensive this study was. So you're limited with what you can do, because, like, rather than all these doses, we wanted the doses that we test. We wanted to measure muscle protein synthesis every possible way, digestion in every possible way, whole body protein synthesis, bunch more. But yeah, the more measurements, the less money for doses. So we picked 0, just what happens if you don't have anything. We took 25 grams, which is kind of the upper limit of what's normally assumed to be the maximum dose, 22, 25, and then 100 grams for the simple reason, again, a barbecue. We did just a simple pilot in the lab, and we looked at what, like, let's call it the fitness bro guys, how much they could comfortably eat, like not overfeeding, like, oh, I need to hit 150, just how much protein would a bro eat without truly forcing this. So someone who likes protein and fitness, and that ended up being about 100 grams. So we thought 100 grams is like in a normal setting, like, no, it's not what you're going to consume every meal, but that's more or less the practical upper limit of what can be consumed. And the only goal was just to test that dogma, is 25 all you need? It's not to say you need 100 grams. Maybe at 50 grams, there is a maximum. We can get into that, but that's not the purpose. The main purpose was just to challenge 20, 25 is all you need.
And the exercise, describe the exercise protocol real quickly.
It was fairly basic. It was just whole body exercise, resistance training. So from top of my head, it was, I think, 4 sets of leg press, 4 sets of leg extension, I think 3 sets of pull downs, and 3 sets of chest press. And more or less everything was like 1 rep in reserve. It was still
Right.
volatile fatigue, but under some encouragement, so not yelling like, come on, come on. But of course, if you're a subject and the researcher is like, give it everything you got, maybe 1 rep left in the tank. Most people go pretty hard. So it depends a little bit on the subject, somewhere between 1 and 2 reps in the tank. Some people hit failure on a set here and there.
So are you of the opinion that it's total protein intake over the course of the day that's paramount and timing and distribution is secondary?
Yes. So I think that that concept has been around for a long time, that it's probably the most important, how much protein you get in a day. And then there's some debate to what the importance of protein distribution is, where some people are like, ooh, this is really important because, again, you oxidize everything once your meal is too big. And then some people are like, it probably doesn't matter at all. I think with this study, if you look at the evidence, like what supported that, let's call it theory of protein distribution, it's not really the long-term studies that supported it. Again, there are some limitations in long-term studies where you want tons of subjects before you can clearly see something. So I was always like, maybe once we have a lot more data, at some point we can do a meta-analysis and then we'll see a small benefit. But really, the only evidence was that mechanistic acute work, where the idea is if you consume too much, you start oxidizing it all. And that just, our data just showed that isn't true at all. So in my mind, most of the argument in favor of protein distribution is gone. Does that mean in practice, you should not distribute your protein intake? Well, I don't think it's super important that you do, but if you're a competitive bodybuilder, why wouldn't you? Like, it's not that difficult. But again, how much of an added value will it have? I think very little.
So it's sort of, six of one, half dozen of another. If, like, for instance, Tony works with a lot of professional fighters and they train certainly more than once a day,
Right.
Sometimes hours per day. So speculate a little on if you have someone consuming 200 grams of protein a day, whether it matters if they're doing 100 in the morning, 100 in the evening versus 50-50, 50-50 spread out throughout the day. Will it matter? Here's the thing. Will it matter from a muscle protein synthesis standpoint or a recovery standpoint? Or how about this? It might inhibit their hunger, so they're not thinking about food. Instead, they're thinking about training.
I, like Richie, will be the judge of this, I guess. But the first thing that came to mind is good luck eating 100 grams of protein and getting a liver kick. Like 100 grams
Spot
of
on.
unless
Yes,
it's like,
You'll lose 50 grams right there.
yeah, like unless it's from like maybe easy digestible protein powder, you're not gonna eat 100 grams of protein anyway. So these are very fun academic exercises. But yeah, anyone who works in practice know that protein is relatively tough on the stomach, and too big of a meal is just not gonna sit well with training. Now, let's ignore that for a moment. Do I think it matters for your physiology? Again, I would say the higher your protein intake is, the smaller the chance that protein distribution has an added effect. Because like if you look, for example, at my data, just with the more protein, just plasma amino acids rise much longer and they stay elevated much longer. Imagine if you have even more protein. So ultimately, the goal of protein, like protein quality, is another discussion you can have. But ultimately, the goal, well, I guess the main goal is to provide essential amino acids to your tissues so they have the building blocks and the signals for optimal functioning. As long as you eat enough protein, that protein is going to digest during the whole day. So you will always have them available, and your body has no clue whether that protein just came in on your empty stomach or that it came 6 hours ago and only now it's through your gut, which, well, your stomach, I should say, and it's been there for a couple of hours. Like, there's no difference until it comes into the circulation. It was never accessible to your muscle anyway.
Right.
Now, again, in practice, I wouldn't know why an athlete wouldn't want to distribute it. Like, it's so easy to distribute your protein. As you're aware, I've done quite some research on pre-sleep protein. And back then, everyone's like, you're pushing protein distribution. That doesn't really matter, which is really fun because now I'm sort of on the other camp. But I'm like, pre-sleep protein is the easiest habit. Like, usually you're at home. Like, it's the easiest to just take 1 or 2 scoops of protein. It's more protein in the day. You possibly some distribution advantages. Why wouldn't you do it? So from a practical point of view, why wouldn't you aim for some protein distribution? Now, what I don't want is that people stressing and setting their alarm, and in the middle of the night, I have to eat again, or I have to run out of class or work because you need to eat every 4 hours. I think my study really shows that is absolutely not necessary. But in practice, why wouldn't you try to have some reasonable protein distribution?
Makes sense, yeah. And one other quick question, and by the way, inspired by you and your team, I don't think you can see it. Oh, there you go. I just had about 75 grams, so I want to thank you for that.
Excellent. It's
Yes,
light work. I expected more from you, but training the gut, like,
we'll get up there. We'll get up there. So, and so with to our best assertion, even in a small, like with a lot of the fighters, as you know, you're in weight class athletes, if there was a caloric deficit, we still would probably make the same assertions regarding protein distribution and timing versus a large bolus. Might that be correct? Or
yeah, so that triggers a few topics in my head. So obviously, with a lower caloric intake in general, there's just more pressure on your protein to use it as a fuel. Generally, you because you're in a more catabolic situation, you try to keep your protein up. But just the general concept that protein distribution doesn't really have much added value. I don't see why energy status per se would impact that.
okay.
Now, what is interesting is, like, if you ask me, what do I think? This is super not academic, but my guess is that probably your protein requirements scale based on the amount of lean body mass you have. Like, that makes so much sense. In practice, there's not that much good evidence for it that a big guy needs all that much more protein than a small guy. Now, that's partly because most of the studies there's not that many studies and they're not all that good. But I'm not like, what my gut feeling is based on the data I've seen, it's not like a guy that's 2 times as big needs 2 times the amount of protein. He probably needs more protein. So what does that mean in practice? That means that smaller athletes, they almost surely have enough protein because, yeah, almost any amount is good for them. I would just say, if you're an athlete that's bigger than, let's say, the average subject in a study, you probably need a little bit more. But it's not like, oh, I'm 20% heavier, I also need 20% more than the studies recommend.
Right.
Did you address the concept of, people argue about whether there's an upper limit? I think even the title of your paper suggested there is no upper limit. Pragmatically, there has to be a limit. And also physiologically, your gut and your, small intestine can only handle so much. So I guess address that issue both theoretically and pragmatically, that there has to be a limit somewhere. I mean, there's a limit to height. Actually, I don't know. I was about to say there's a limit to body weight, but I'm not sure that's true because humans seem to be getting larger. But there has to be some sort of digestive limit.
Yeah, so this kind of gets into the debate, like, how should a title of a paper be? So I want to start with a big disclaimer. If you read the paper, first of all, I know for sure I wrote the longest limitation section you'll ever see in a paper like this. So when someone says like, ooh, the title is kind of hypey, I guess it is, but there's no way you mistake what I mean if you actually read the paper.
Right.
Then number two, when you read the whole paper, you'll see that nowhere in the paper I say, so this paper means you need to eat this much protein in a meal. Nowhere does it say this means this is how much protein you need to consume in a day. I don't even say protein distribution is nonsense. All I say is, hey, maybe protein distribution, that concept, maybe you can be a little bit more flexible. And if you know you won't have your next meal in the next couple of hours, you probably want to increase your meal so you can last. Like that is the main practical lesson from this paper. Now, is there an upper limit? Of course there is. If there wasn't, I would be Ronnie Coleman. I would just slam protein shakes all day. And that's just not going to work, unfortunately. So yes, there is an upper limit. Now that might be related to several things. On one hand, just like you mentioned, a practical upper limit of how much you can consume. Again, as I mentioned, like we could pretty comfortably consume 100 grams of protein in a barbecue, but it's not like you'll do that 6 hours later again. So there's just so much you can eat on a day. Also,
Jorn, I'm sorry to interrupt. Have you ever watched the Nathan hot dog eating contest?
no.
Oh, okay. Well,
Joey Chestnut.
not that I would recommend you watch it, but in Long Island, New York, every year they have a hot dog eating contest. And Tony, correct me if I'm wrong, but in 10 or 12 minutes, they can eat 70 to 80 hot dogs.
I think Joey Chestnut's record's in the mid 80s.
Yes. Yeah. So
80 hot dogs with buns, by the way. You got a
with
little
buns, right?
Dude, they dip them in water, right?
They do.
Yes.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yes.
And I've always wondered, and you might be able to speculate on this. What happens to all, I mean, I know hot dogs have a lot of fat, but there's still a lot of protein in 80 something hot dogs. What happens to all of that? And professional eaters, and I don't know if you have professional eaters in Holland, but we got professional eaters here. So
that's cool. We might
they would be
I never really thought of that concept, but we might have to recruit them for a study. Like I doubt we'll get a huge sample size, but it would be cool just to test some concepts. But my expectation there is that they would be like the snake. They would just be digesting that food for a couple of days. I don't know do you have any links to them? Like it would be interesting to just shoot them in emails. Like how much do you eat in the next 2 days? That might give some indication whether their gut is full and sends the signals to the brain, yo, we're full, just stop eating. What's also very interesting is, because I read all that snake research for this, is that the snake uses, like in the first day, most of the protein synthesis is to increase his gut, like the villi in his gut. They go completely nuts. They're like, oh, we have to digest this insane meal. So all the organs start growing. It's not like, oh, all the protein is going to the muscle of the snake.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, here in terms of real life, snake consumption, we have pythons here that are consuming whole alligators.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alligators whole.
Yeah. And it's actually a problem in Florida because pythons are not indigenous to Florida, and they're actually causing issues with alligators because you have videos of, you see a python and it looks like there's an alligator basically inside the python. It's absolutely amazing. Well, let me ask you this. I think Stu Phillips, he's a big fan of the 1.6 grams per kilo total protein intake per day. I'm someone who thinks you could certainly go up to 1 gram per pound or 2.2 grams per kilo, depending on depending on the person, depending on the athlete. Now, if you're dealing with high-end athletes, whether they're elite endurance athletes, run, bike, or swim, or in this case, elite fighters who train probably harder than 99.99% of humanity. Do you think 1.6 is enough?
It's a difficult question. So I'll just share some of my thoughts. if you look at, so that 1.6 is based on that meta-regression data from Stu. And what they essentially do there is they look at all the studies on protein supplementation, and then at what protein intake did protein supplementation, did it appear to stop resulting in additional gains? And then they do a breakpoint analysis to determine that. Now, when you look at that graph, like I've done breakpoint analysis, and my R squares are like 0.95 and higher, and I'm like, sweet. When you look at that graph, you see like, okay, if I have to make a very rough estimation, the model says 1.6. I would consider that a good starting point to do more studies. But it's not like, oh, see, when we design everything, like when we throw all the data in it, it's very clear that at 1.6, everything stops. No, it's a lot of dots over the place. So I see it as in general, like people love to say like, no, you have to look at meta-analysis. They're the highest form of research, but that's not really how it works. It's like when we throw a lot of different stuff together, then this comes out, and that's then a starting point to design better studies, and it keeps reiterating. It's not like the meta-analysis and we're done. So I would consider that 1.6 is a good starting point to thinking what the maximum could be. Now, we've done a study in Dutch from very talented young athletes all the way to some Olympic athletes. We've done a study where we looked at their protein intakes, and then in a small sample of them, we use nitrogen balance to see, hey, what you reported with 24-hour questionnaires, how does that stack up with the nitrogen in your urine? And it seemed like they underreported protein intake by 25%. That's athletes.
That's
My
interesting.
assumption would be that an athlete is better aware of the protein in his diet than, let's say, college kids, let's call it that. So that just makes me think if athletes are already underreporting protein intake by 25%, maybe that like the subjects in that meta-analysis, where usually habitual protein intake is based on self-reported data, maybe that is also 25% underreported. So maybe you shift that up 25%. Is that true? I don't know, but
Good thought, though. Yeah.
seems very possible.
Yeah.
Now, then the other question is, how much higher do you need to go, and does it truly benefit the elite athletes? For example, you've done some studies with higher protein intakes. There, I am the other kind of skeptical, in the sense that I don't know, but I would be skeptical that subjects truly eat that amount of protein for that duration. I think they might be over-reporting. Yes, Dr. Professor Antonio, yes, I ate everything. I don't know if they truly ate. Like, so I'm skeptical of normal people because they underreport. And then I think people who are on those extreme diets, they're probably over-reporting to make you proud. But then we get back to the question, are higher protein intakes beneficial? I would say possibly. Like this again really comes down to practical considerations, like how much effort is it to consume a little bit more protein? What are the downsides? I don't think there are many downsides in healthy elite athletes. Even if it's just for the peace of mind, try to consume a little bit more protein. Now, if your athlete is reporting, I hate all these protein shakes you're giving me, then it's probably not worth it. But I would at the least experiment with it.
Yeah, I know from the self-reports, because I've done a lot of those chronic protein supplementation studies. I would say that, as you mentioned, almost everyone underreports, except one group, male bodybuilders. If you ask a male bodybuilder what they eat, they know exactly to the gram carbs, fat, and protein. So I guarantee you they weren't over-reporting, because those were male bodybuilders, particularly in the we did a 2-year follow-up. And knowing those guys, I know a lot of them personally. There was one guy who was averaging, I think, 400 grams a day, and he was getting 400 grams a day. So I think unless you're dealing with male bodybuilders, it is true that the population, people are just not good at remembering what they eat. I think that's part of the issue.
Yeah, so it's two things. It's the remembering is just difficult. Like people kind of know what they had for dinner, but they forget the snacks and especially the drinks. But then the other aspect is socially desired answers, where you see that obese people tend to over-report, of course. They're not forgetting their meals. They just know that they eat too much, so they intentionally leave it out because
Yeah, they underreport.
they may be ashamed of it. So I'm just wondering, like, it might be different if you have a bit of a personal relationship with those bodybuilders, but bodybuilders, they know, or at least think, that they have to consume very high amounts of protein. So I could, even if there was one day less, they're like, I'm not admitting, like in bodybuilding, like, you know, hardcore, that's their lifestyle. So I doubt if a bodybuilder slipped up for one day that they would admit it to you. Although maybe if they, you know, if you have a bit of a relationship with them, then they would probably be honest. And then the other thing is, depending on how the study is designed, subjects kind of change their behavior in when they know they have to keep a dietary record, for example. So that's an advantage of a surprise 24-hour recall. At like with a trained dietitian, you should be able to really drag all the information out of them. But if you just give them a dietary record, people are like, no, I'm not going to eat that because it's a hassle to write it down. So it was so interesting to me that I use like the most expensive research methodologies to measure, essentially like throwing a little bit of salt on a beach and then a year later counting exactly how much salt there is. We can do that, but then in the human body with, you know, where the amino acids go. But dietary intake, we struggle measuring that in humans. That's just funny to me. Like, it should be the simplest thing in the world.
Yeah, I mean, there are you know, certainly limitations in doing the chronic work. What are your thoughts though on, because you have a lot of acute data. You do a feeding, I mean, and others as well, Phillips Lab, you do a feeding, you measure MPS over X number of hours. The question I always get, particularly from bodybuilders or strength power athletes, is, well, how does that apply to me training for years, eating mixed meals multiple times throughout the day? A single feed of just protein doesn't in any way match what life actually is. And that's the common criticism of these acute feeding studies. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's obviously some truth to that. And then like, well, especially online, like usually people are like in one or two camps, like, oh, it's mechanistic work, so it doesn't count at all. Or they blindly believe it because, well, I've heard more about Dr. Trommelen and Dr. Phillips, and everything they do is good, right? And neither of those approaches is how you should think of this. So in the ideal world, any concept you've tested in an acute study, you want to verify in a long-term study. The issue with the long-term studies is that most long-term studies are not long-term studies. They're like 4 to 6 week studies with a handful of subjects. And for example, people just overestimate the effect of protein in general. If you look at studies where there's protein supplementation, about 80% of them doesn't even show that protein supplementation increases muscle mass. Now, I think we all agree, yes, protein supplementation can increase muscle mass, but it's simply because if your study is too short, one group gains 100 grams, the other group gains 200 grams, and you can't detect that difference. Now, if you follow those groups for a year, then it would be like 2 kilograms versus 4 kilograms. You can detect that difference. So long-term studies are a thing of beauty, but they should truly be long-term with sufficient subjects and good measurement techniques. If you do that, that is the holy grail, of course, but very difficult, especially in athletes, because why would the government ever invest money in athletes? So that's the challenge with the long-term studies. Now with the acute studies, at the end of the day, you're doing something pretty artificial. So you should never blindly trust a concept from an acute study. So you'll have to do some extrapolation, and for that you kind of have to understand the method. Like there's plenty of studies where I think like interesting, I don't expect it to translate, and then there's a lot of things where I think, oh yeah, that might translate as well. It's difficult to just in 10 seconds explain how that works. You just need a lot of experience with the method, so to speak. But so I'll give you an example. If I give you guys a liter of water and then we put you on a DEXA, all of a sudden you've gained a kilogram of lean mass. Now, we all know that's an artifact of, say, a DEXA scan. As long as you know how DEXA scans work, you can completely avoid that limitation.
Right.
Now, if you give someone a liter of water, then you measure muscle protein synthesis, you'll see zero effect. Now, does that mean that the muscle protein synthesis studies are better? No, they have a different set of assumptions. If you do studies where those assumptions are violated, then you can throw it in the trash. And the same with long-term studies. So what people really need is a good, like my pet peeve in science is when things don't align, they pick, oh, I like this the best, or at least I can wrap my head around this the best. So this is the best, and then we ignore everything else. If observational animal data, even cell studies, acute studies, long-term studies, if they don't align, what you should say is, these data don't seem to align. In one of those types of research, we're missing something. How are we going to align this? So that's basically what I did here. I said, like, these long-term intermittent fasting studies don't see much of a difference in muscle mass. These acute studies strongly suggest you only need 20 grams. One of the two, something doesn't seem to add up. In this case, I thought in the acute studies, they're missing something, namely, you have to measure longer. And I think that's the approach people should take. They should, like, I know if I was younger and listening to this, you want to have like a short answer, like this is the best type of research, just follow that. No, every type of research has pros and cons. And unless you know the pros and cons, you have no clue if a single study is good or bad.
Let me ask you this. What, if you were to do a follow-up to this study, using a different protein source, would you find anything different, particularly if you used a plant-based source? Would you think the results would be different?
So again, this study was designed as proof of principle that 20 grams, 25 grams is not all you need in a meal. So I'm 99% certain that general concept would be the same with a plant-based protein. That also with a plant-based meal, your total anabolic response as well as the duration would be longer than with 25 grams. Having said that, if you would do everything the same, just switch the type of protein, I could see that the total anabolic response would be smaller with the plant-based protein compared to the animal protein. Having said that, it's very similar as with protein distribution. Ultimately, the goal of protein intake is just provide your body with all the building blocks you need. Once you have 100 grams in a meal, even if it's a lower quality type of protein, like let's say the protein quality is 15% lower, then effectively you ate 85 grams of highly quality protein. So what are we talking about? Like you're set, so to speak. But yeah, so as a general concept, yes, I think protein choice can make a little bit of an impact on the anabolic response, but the higher your protein intake, the less relevant that is. If you're a vegan and you eat a lot of protein, it probably doesn't matter. In practice, the issue with veganism is that a lot of them eat less protein in general, and it's lower quality. Then things become an issue. If they all ate infinite amounts of protein, like the amounts you give in your study, it really doesn't matter. Like they have everything they could possibly need.
Yeah.
Just a quick question to you on that somewhat follows up on that. And I apologize for asking questions that they're mostly assertion, but is there a disparity? Because there's so many genetic differences, right, from person to person, that delineate what their metabolism is. If I put in 100 grams in a group of 25-year-olds, comparable weight, comparable activity level, that rate of breakdown and then the time it reaches the periphery, is that almost a constant from person to person? Or do some people have more protease enzymes? Not that it's going to make a significant difference over the course of a couple of hours, but I've always wondered what the capacity is for some people have an aversion to protein. Is that in part because it is sitting in the gut longer, as opposed to somebody else who might have greater protease enzymes and can knock down a 42-ounce porterhouse and they're ready to eat an hour again later? Might there be something with that?
Yeah, well, I would say yes. So first of all, like when I have data, I have, of course, data on all the individual subjects, and then you see the values, you know, there's quite a range in that. Now, what we do know with protein, especially like the higher quality protein, so most animal proteins, like digestibility, so how much in total you digest and then absorb, is almost 90% for everyone all of the time, if it's like isolated, not when you start adding in fiber. However, one person might be digesting that meal a lot longer than someone else. For example, because they have less digestive enzymes. Now, another example is what you guys just brought up. I'm not going to put 80 hot dogs in my stomach, right? So there is this concept of, in carbohydrates, it's very popular, training the gut. That might apply here as well. So that brings up another discussion point, which ties in a little bit what Jose just mentioned with the acute studies. With an acute study, you'll always have at least some amount where you wonder what happens if I do this more often. So on one hand, you could speculate if you always do these absurd 100 grams meals. Like in my study, we saw almost nothing got burned, wasted. But if protein becomes a really relatively large percentage of your macronutrient intake, I could see a shift where your body says, well, we have so much of this, we might as well start using it as a fuel. So there's no guarantee that if you keep doing this forever, your metabolic response is the same. Now, you can also speculate the other way, that your body thinks, this is awesome, we're always getting a lot of protein, let's upregulate our capacity to use it. This brings me back to the snake, where if a snake eats one of these large meals, the first thing the body says, this is awesome, we're going to upregulate the gut so we can digest it all. So who knows, maybe you become more anabolic,
right?
Like your body, like, oh, this is awesome, we have like so much awesomeness coming in, let's optimize anabolism because things will always be good. Or it might be the opposite, like this is unnecessary to keep doing this. You never know for sure, and that's why you always need a combination of research.
Great.
Now, you did some work on it was pre-sleep protein ingestion on mitochondrial protein synthesis. Is that correct?
Yep.
What would you, and obviously that would matter particularly to endurance athletes. What would you speculate as to what would happen if an endurance athlete did that chronically?
Well, what you hope that happens is that over time that would increase either mitochondrial abundance and or function. So theoretically, more mitochondria is a higher capacity to use fuels. And basically the way I think of endurance exercises, you're just a human furnace, and whoever can burn the most fuel for the longest will win. So that is the theoretical benefit. Now, am I convinced that will happen? Not necessarily. Like, it seems like the main limiting factor in endurance is more in the cardiovascular aspect, not necessarily in the muscle metabolism, how much can be oxidized there. So it's really difficult to say. Like, I think that the benefits of protein are not limited to the mitochondria. That's just that study. My assumption would be that, for example, in this study we just discussed with 100 grams of protein, we very clearly saw that with more protein, plasma protein synthesis would also be higher. based on that, you would expect that the pre-sleep protein would also increase plasma proteins that carry oxygen, which might be more important than the mitochondria. But that is speculation, of course.
Hey, we're running out of time, but I want to get two last questions in. One, future research, let the audience know. And two, when you're giving advice, so people are going to ask you for advice because you do a lot of great work, particularly with protein. What advice do you give? And let's just deal with two populations, strength power athletes and endurance athletes. Protein intake, carb intake, fat intake. I know you're a protein guy, but I'm sure you're asked about carbs and fat as well. In terms of dosing per day, what do you tell them?
Okay, so let's start with the strength athletes. I would like, as a starting point, I would usually start with at 1.6. We discussed that. I don't think that's the holy grail, but I think that's a good starting point. And from there, ideally, I would over time increase protein intake and just see how the athlete responds. So I see like, ideally, I want a large percentage of caloric intake in protein because there's pretty much only upside. Of course, you have to take into account carbohydrates and fat. Now, for a strength athlete, I wouldn't worry that much about carbohydrate and fat. I don't like ketogenic diets, so I wouldn't go low carb, but I would leave it up to the preference of the athlete. Now, for endurance, it's a little bit different. I would still use that starting point of 1.6 gram per kilogram per day. Probably not all that much higher for an endurance athlete, but there carbohydrates become a lot more important. But there you really have to distinguish between what your goal is. It performance in the moment, or is it training adaptations? There's some reasonable evidence that a high carbohydrate availability during training sessions kind of reduces the need for training adaptations. So training at least once a week with a low carbohydrate availability. So ideally overnight fasted and then a morning training without any carbohydrates. And only after that you start to refuel. But during actual exercise, during performance, when you want to win, there you absolutely want to maximize carbohydrate oxidation rates. The way to do it is to have carbohydrate intake from 60 to all the way to 120 grams per hour. Now, 120 grams per
That's
hour
a
is
lot.
absurd. You need to train the gut. It's well, too long for now. And what's important there is that you consume your carbohydrates as a mixture of glucose and fructose because they are absorbed in different transporters. So your uptake rate is higher. But again, that's only during an event where you want to maximally perform. And maybe very quickly for Richie, that multiple transportable carbohydrates concept is also pretty interesting for glycogen repletion. For example, if your athletes are doing a weight cut for weighing in, that same concept applies there. And again, fat I see as this boring nutrient where you probably don't want to go under 20% of your energy intake, but it's more you play around with it. And usually, unless you avoid it, in practice, most athletes end up above that anyway. So yes, I'm very protein centric. That's the first one I always fill in from the macronutrients. Then carbohydrates as needed, and fat more or less fills in itself as long as you stay above that 20% energy percentage.
Yeah, let me, Tony, before you comment, just, Jorn, I want to tell you what I do. My wife is a national class cyclist. She does time trials. She specialized in time trials, 5K and 10K. Her carb intake is maybe 3 grams per kilo. Her protein intake is 3 grams per kilo, and her fat intake is about 1. And again, this is an N of 1, but since I know her, I live with her. She does better on very high protein intakes, but with a couple things. One, her body composition's better because if she's eating that protein, she tends to be eating less carbs. So her body comps better. And two, she says she just physically feels better. She says she feels lighter. But again, a 5K and 10K time trial, it's not that, I mean, it's fast.
Yeah, that's also like I would classify that more towards the spectrum
Right.
than to the truly endurance. Like that,
Right.
that are the exercise durations where we don't recommend the high carbohydrate intakes, not even during
Yeah.
exercise. Yeah.
So I just wanted to, Tony, I didn't know if you had a comment about,
No,
something.
I was just happy to hear you're starting with 1.6 for the endurance athlete, which is now becoming a little bit more accepted. It's usually a 1.2, a 1.1, because you had these absurd numbers in the past of I don't want to say they're absurd, but I mean there aren't that many people that could eat 10 to 12 grams carbs per kilogram, right? And if doing so, that pushes your protein at some given point that you know, I mean, you're eating 4,000 calories in carbs per day. So that pushes your protein down almost 0.8 to 1. So anyway, it was good to hear that a 1.6 in the endurance athlete is a very solid start and a very good protein intake as what was considered previously. So
I am absolutely a science nerd, and there's nothing more like than the complicated calculations that probably a max 10 people in the world understand. But I know enough about practice that like like we done studies on macronutrient intake in athletes, and endurance athletes, almost all of, on average, they ate 1.5 grams of protein per kilogram per day anyway. So anyone who comes with this recommendation of 1.2 is actually saying, oh, you should eat less than you're already doing. So I'm like, where does this come from? And makes no sense. And on top of that, that 1.5 gram, that is from that study where we saw that the ones we tested appear to underreport by 25%.
Okay.
So there's 1 point. So unless you want to put out the message, no, you actively need to avoid protein, which I don't think is beneficial. So
Agree.
yeah, occasionally doing a study and actually trying to track micronutrient intake, for example, gives a lot of perspective. And I think the tracer studies are cool, but again, the more types of research you do, just the better overall picture you can form.
Yeah, I love that you do a lot of these acute studies, super expensive. I don't think people appreciate that, and also trying to combine it with some of the chronic data and also, real world data working with athletes. And you'll see that it's never a clean fit. You're sort of trying to figure out, okay, at the end of the day, I want the athlete to do well, but I'll see what the literature says and try to, modify it for the athlete. But I'll tell you this, Jordan, you do some amazing work. I love what you do.
Agreed.
By the way, if for those of you on Instagram, your Instagram page is Nutrition Tactics. Is that correct?
Yep.
It's a great page. You haven't been on it for a while though. It'd be nice if you put some new stuff on there.
When I started doing this study, we call it the barbecue study. At that moment, I decided I'm no longer doing any podcast. Before that, I was quite active because I kind of enjoy it. But I was like, from the moment I started, like, I have this hypothesis that this 20 grams is not optimal. It's still what's kind of evidence-based. Do I really want to tell that? So I just stopped appearing on podcasts. I still was, kind of active on the social media, for example, Instagram. But it's been so busy lately, but I'm going to pick it up. Don't worry.
Well, I'm following you, so I'm looking forward to it.
Any new projects? Could you tell the audience anything new coming up? Are you going to present ACSM or?
So I set up a new technique in our lab that can estimate protein requirements based on breath analysis, pretty much. So it's non-invasive, which will allow us to do a lot of work because usually our studies are with muscle biopsies. Good luck getting professional athletes to do that. So with this new tool, it gives us, more opportunities to study understudied populations. So where I'm using it now is on the intensive care because these people are fighting for their life. You're not gonna go with biopsy needles while they're in a coma, and then if they make it, they wake up, it's like, what the heck did you do? So just an example how it opens up new opportunities. But bodybuilders, elite athletes, all those things will come on the radar now. So hopefully, using that technique in every possible population. If there's Dutch bodybuilders, you're probably up next.
Tony, any last words? This has been really great with Jorn. I love this.
Well, that's my only words. Fantastic. Very just incredible information and incredible work of which I learned from. And thanks for bringing it to us and bringing it to our industry. And truly, it's excellent work and needed, and we appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Jorn. And I want to thank you for appearing on the Sports Science Dudes. And we certainly look forward to any new cool science you're doing. So once again, thank you. I know it's late where you are, and we appreciate your time. So thank you so much, Jorn.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.